Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's Hi5 seminar. We have a guest today who I've known for a few years, Jerald Thomas. He's currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Minnesota, working under a good old friend of mine, Dr. Evan Suma Rosenberg. Hi, Evan. I hope you're watching. You better be watching. You better be subscribed as well. I'm playing, but no joke. If you're watching, please subscribe because our URL for the channel we can customize if we hit 100 subscribers, and right now it's youtube.com/1000 random characters. So if we can change that to something more memorable, that'd be awesome. But anyway, back on track. Jerald's going to be talking to us today about some of the work that he's been doing, looking at redirected walking, redirected movements in virtual environments. And he's going to be defending, I believe, this coming fall. So again, be on the lookout if you're looking to hire awesome VR people. So without any further ado, I'm going to flip this over to Jerald. Okay, Jerald, you are live.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Adam, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak. My name is Jerald Thomas. I am currently, as Adam mentioned, finishing up my PhD studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and I intend to defend my dissertation sometime this summer. Broadly, my research interests are in determining novel ways to make virtual and augmented reality more usable. And for my dissertation, I have a narrow focus on natural locomotion and virtual reality. In this talk, I'm going to briefly talk about my dissertation research. I'm going to kind of pick some of the more interesting experiments that we've run along the way. I'm going to first introduce the concept of redirected walking, how it works and why we use it. I will then detail two limitations with the current state of redirected walking. And finally, I'm going to explain how my work extends this state of the art in order to address these two limitations. So broadly speaking, the problem that we're trying to solve is locomotion. How do we allow the user to navigate through the virtual environment? Several methods exist, but all compromise various desired system qualities. Here you see two representative images of two different techniques. On the left is teleportation, where a user can indicate
Hey,
a
Jerald.
point in the, yeah.
I'm not seeing your slides.
All right, I'm gonna stop the share and reshare.
Okay. Hey, now
Is
we've
that
got
better?
slides. Awesome.
All right, sorry for the hiccup, everyone. So as I was saying, on the left, we have teleporting, where a user can denote a point in the virtual environment that they want to go to, somehow indicate that they want to teleport, usually by pushing a button or something, and then they just kind of appear there. And on the right, we have what is often referred to as flying, where a user just uses the joystick to translate their virtual representation through the scene. These come at some pretty detrimental effects. So teleporting will greatly decrease a user's spatial awareness, or like how aware they are of the virtual environment, including their ability to navigate. And flying will greatly increase simulator sickness. Natural locomotion, or allowing the user to actually physically walk in VR, has several benefits. It improves spatial awareness and the user's sense of presence. Both these are highly sought after features in virtual environments. It also reduces simulator sickness because it reduces the mismatch between the user's emotions and the perceptions of their emotions. However, there's still one very large problem with natural locomotion in VR. Obviously, we are bounded by real world constraints. The current solution for that And the solution adopted by most commercial VR applications that use natural locomotion is to use what's called room scale locomotion, where we constrain the user to a very small physical environment. The problem is that the virtual environment that we want to explore is usually larger than this space. There are several fixes to the problem, but one of the more reliable ones that does not sacrifice the benefits provided by natural locomotion is called redirected walking. Redirected walking was introduced in 2001 by Sri Frazek at UNC Chapel Hill. And the main boon is that it utilizes natural locomotion, and it effectively increases the size of the physical environment. It does this by taking advantage of the fact that our visual sense will dominate our vestibular sense to a degree. This is done through subtle illusions that enable a user to walk a physical path that is different than their virtual path. And we call these illusions gains. Here's an example of a redirected walking experience. In fact, it was the first published redirected walking experience. The user can explore the virtual environment shown in blue while staying within the confines of the physical space shown in red. As mentioned, this works by introducing these imperceptible discrepancies known as gains, of which there are three. The first gain is translation gain, where a virtual representation is translated either faster or slower than the physical representation. Rotation gain is when a user rotates either faster or slower in the virtual environment than in the physical environment. And curvature gain is slightly different. Curvature gain works by introducing a rotation to the virtual user's point of view as they walk forward. And if this rotation is small enough, the user will accommodate for this by rotating their body the opposite direction of the induced rotation, effectively having the physical user walk on a curve. Each of these gains have what we call a perceptual threshold, or to what degree we can apply it before the average user notices the manipulation. I don't want to get too deep into this, but essentially you can see that for the three gains, we have quite a bit of wiggle room to play with. And finally here, you can see an example of a redirected walking experience live, or not live, but in video. And so on the top left, you can see a top-down view of the virtual environment. The green square represents the physical environment. And then on the top right, you can see the user actually navigating through the physical environment. These three gains are being used in combination to compress the user's movement into this smaller physical space. And the neat thing is that if we do it right, redirected walking can both be imperceptible and will not induce simulated sickness more than natural locomotion would. And this is great, but I want to draw your attention to the physical space that you see here, and note that it is a large open environment. And this brings me to the first limitation of current implementations of redirected walking. And that is the lack of accommodation for what I call non-ideal physical environments. A non-ideal physical environment means that it is it is convex, usually rectangular, free of obstacles, and static. Obviously, these assumptions do not align well with most real-world spaces. Luckily for us, these problems, or problems similar to them, have been worked on for a very long time by the robotics community. And I draw a lot of my inspiration in the algorithms I developed to address this from that community. At the top of my talk, I mentioned that I was going to address two limitations. And so I want to get to the second one real quick. The second limitation I want to address is the lack of accommodation for physical interactions. There are a lot of reasons why a VR user may want to interact with the physical world. One of the more compelling of these is passive haptics, in which a physical object is used as an analog or a proxy for a virtual counterpart. counterpart. Passive haptics has been shown to increase the user's presence and task performance. But redirected walking, for reasons that we're going to get to in a bit later, breaks the ability to interact with the physical environment. So getting back to that first limitation, this is a selection of the work I presented at IEEE VR in 2019 about using artificial potential functions to create a new reactive redirected walking algorithm. So just recap, this is aiming to solve the problem that redirected walking does not allow for non-ideal physical environments. That is, environments that are not convex, that may or may not, or that may have obstacles, and where those obstacles may be dynamic. First, we need to talk about redirected walking algorithms, though. These algorithms choose the rotation, translation, and curvature gain levels to apply when and at what levels, and usually on a frame-by-frame basis. Currently, there are two categories of redirected walking algorithms. The first is reactive. Reactive algorithms have no knowledge of the user's future movement, and as such, they usually need to implement some sort of greedy approach that relies on a simple heuristic to try to optimize locally in a reactive manner. Predictive algorithms do have some sort of knowledge of the future movement, whether that be virtual path that they know that the user must follow, or a constrained set of paths that they can try to optimize for. These predictive algorithms are generally a computationally exhaustive approach, or they can be done manually in very constrained scenarios. Currently, if you have an unconstrained experience, you have to use a reactive algorithm. In this work, we are showing for the first time that it's possible to have an algorithm that maintains the generalizable properties of reactive algorithms while obtaining some of the more favorable properties of predictive algorithms. One thing I failed to mention earlier is how we handle the event of a user that would collide with a physical boundary or obstacle. Even the best redirected walking algorithms, we need to assume that they need to use perceptual thresholds. And so we assume that they will not be perfectly able to keep the user away from boundaries and obstacles. When a user is about to collide with a boundary, we initiate what's called a reset. So the user is about to collide with a boundary, we stop their experience, we have them rotate to a particular virtual or particular physical location, usually the center of the physical environment, and then we send them on their way. Obviously, these resets break the experience and are very undesirable. And as such, they're the main metric that we use when comparing different redirected walking algorithms. We normally use the number of resets that were encountered for a given virtual path. We also use the mean virtual distance traveled between resets for a given virtual path. Here are two of the most commonly used reactive algorithms. Steer to center on the left chooses gains such as to guide the user to the center of the physical environment. And steer to orbit on the right chooses gains to guide the user to an orbit of the center of the physical environment. However, as soon as you start to add some obstacles, everything starts to break down. And that is because the algorithm does not intelligently choose where to steer the user. It just relies on a very simple heuristic. And so my solution is to use artificial potential functions to determine a more intelligent steering target. Artificial potential functions are an idea, as I mentioned, borrowed from the field of robotics. They generally represent an abstract energy. So their range usually values between 0 and 1. A higher value means that there's more energy associated with that position or for that point in the range. And generally the goal is to be in a position that represents the lowest energy state. So how can we use this in redirected walking? We can essentially take the physical environment as inputs or as range, or as the range of the function, of the artificial potential function, and calculate where the lowest points are, and those would be the most advantageous positions for the user to be in. I'm not going to get really into the math, but I just want to quickly go over it. So this is the artificial potential function that is used in this work. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that there's an attractive component that will essentially pull the user towards the goal, and a repulsive component that will push the user away from obstacles and boundaries. And it's because of this that we ended up calling this algorithm the push-pull reactive redirected walking algorithm. So I want to give just a brief description of how it works, because I don't think that description alone really satisfies. So if we have, say, a physical environment shown here, where a square with a square obstacle in the center, we can generate an artificial potential function on that environment. And you can see that the obstacle and the boundaries are the highest point, and the lowest points, the minimas, are where the user would be the most advantageous positions for the user to be in. And from there, we can create a gradient map of this artificial potential function, where each point, each location within this physical environment, we can take the gradient at that point, and that will be the direction which is most advantageous to steer the user. With that gradient, we can then choose our gains. So for curvature gain, if the gradient is to the left of the user's forward direction, we'll apply maximum negative curvature gain. Conversely, if it's to the right, we'll apply maximum positive curvature gain. For translation gain, if the user's forward direction is opposite that of the gradient direction, we'll apply minimum translation gain to try to slow them down, essentially. And for rotation gain, if the user is rotating towards the gradient, we're going to apply maximum rotation gain. And if they're rotating away from the gradient, we're going to apply minimum rotation gain. One thing I'd like to point out here is that for anyone familiar with the steer to center, steer to orbit, and the other reactive algorithms, we are not really changing how we choose the gains. Instead, we're choosing this target direction. In our case, it's a gradient direction. In the other cases, it's a direction towards, say, the center of the physical space. So I want to detail one of the experiments that we did in this work. The research question that we sought to ask was, how does this new algorithm, push-pull reactive, compare to steer to center in both ideal and non-ideal physical environments? For this work, we opted for simulation-based evaluation. This is something that's becoming more and more prevalent in redirected walking research. Basically, the problem with human subject studies is that we cannot practically provide enough data points. And when comparing algorithms against each other, as long as we're maintaining these perceptual thresholds that have been previously empirically determined, we should be able to get a good evaluation of how one algorithm compares to another. For each condition, there was 100 trials, and each trial had 100 virtual waypoints. The waypoints were created in ways that were detailed in previous redirected walking literature that also use simulation. We chose to evaluate 3 different physical environments. Environment A was our test case. It had no obstacles and had convex boundaries. Environment B had a non-convex boundary. That is, we essentially placed a square obstacle along one of its edges. And environment C had an interior obstacle. We also decided to test 2 different environment sizes, 10 by 10 meter and 20 by 20 meter. For each of these environments, I'd really like to show you the gradient map, because I think that really clearly states how this algorithm works. So on the left, we have no obstacles or convex boundaries, and the gradient always points essentially to the center of the space. And so because of that, we would expect the performance to be roughly on push-pull reactive to be roughly on par with that of steer to center. And then for environment B and environment C, you can see that it essentially tries to steer the user towards the most advantageous or the most open parts of the physical environment. As mentioned, we had two conditions, and we had two dependent variables, the number of resets and the mean virtual distance traveled between resets. Our first hypothesis, as I alluded to earlier, was that there will be no significant difference in performance between the two algorithms for environment A. And our second hypothesis was that push-pull reactive will perform better than steer to center in both environments B and C. Our results were analyzed using non-parametric tests, as they were not proven to be parametric or normally distributed. And as such, medians and interquartile ranges are reported. We use standard non-parametric analysis techniques, and we maintain the alpha value of 0.05. So for environment A, as expected, there were no significant effects. On the left graph, you can see the reset count. The y-axis is the number of resets, and the x-axis would be the environment size. Here, lower is better. And on the right graph, we have the mean virtual distance per reset, where the left or the x-axis is again environment size, and the y-axis is meters. And here, higher is better. For environment B, that was the non-convex boundary. Steer to center was shown to perform significantly worse than push-pull reactive for all cases. And for environment C, which had the interior obstacle, we had the same results. So this was very exciting results for us, obviously. Again, there was no significant difference in performance for environment A. And P2R consistently performed better than steer to center for environments B and C. So this seems to show that push-pull reactive is a generally superior algorithm than steer to center. It performs as well as steer to center and steer to center's best environment, empty convex environments. And push-pull reactive seems as though it will perform better than steer to center when the environment has obstacles or non-convex boundaries. All right, now we're going to get back to that second limitation I addressed. And for that, I'm going to introduce something that we're calling reactive environmental alignment. This is a subsection of work that we presented at the Weaver workshop at IEEE this year. And as a recap, the motivation here is that redirected walking breaks the ability to have physical interactions. So why is that? So here we have a user that is just walking towards some object, this red cube thing that it wants to interact with. However, in virtual reality, we have to consider both the virtual and the physical environments. And so for traditional natural locomotion, this is still fine because as the physical user walks, their virtual representation is translated through the virtual environment the same amount. However, as soon as we start to introduce redirected walking, this breaks down. And it breaks down in a non-deterministic way. So our solution to this is environmental alignment. I'm going to get into a couple bits of terminology here just so we don't lose each other as we go forward. The pose is a user's position and orientation in 3D space, and the user has both a virtual pose and a physical pose. The mapping is the relationship between the user's virtual and physical poses. And we're defining the identity mapping as a mapping where the relationship between the user's physical and virtual pose is equal to the relationship between the physical and virtual origins. And when this identity mapping is held, physical interactions can happen. However, redirected walking does not maintain this identity mapping, and that is the problem. So we're going to define alignment as the process of using redirected walking techniques to achieve a specific mapping. Specifically, we're going to look at environmental alignment, where we're trying to achieve the identity mapping. And once that identity mapping is achieved, we can then allow for physical interactions. So just as a recap, this is the artificial potential function that we used for the first bit of our work. And one thing I didn't mention then is that we didn't use an attractive component. We didn't have a goal that we wanted the user to achieve. Instead, we just used the repulsive component, where we tried to push users away from obstacles and boundaries. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to reintroduce this attractive component. We're going to create a goal, and that is how we're going to achieve the specific identity mapping. And visually what that looks like is instead of the form minima that would be in this environment with just a repulsive component, we now have a single minimum where that the gradient field points towards. And this is a good way to visualize what's going on, but this is only taking into consideration a two-dimensional configuration space. So what is a configuration space? This is another notion borrowed from the field of robotics. So to break it down, I kind of came up with this little demonstration. So if we have this green Pac-Man entity thing, and it's limited to rotation and translation about the x-axis, and its goal is to get from the left side to the right side. However, it cannot intersect with this little red triangle thing. We can represent its motion as motion through a configuration space, where each point within a space represents a unique configuration of this entity's degrees of freedom. The neat thing about configuration spaces is that we can also model regions within this configuration space that would result with a collision. And so you can see here, there's a narrow passageway that this configuration needs to go through in order to successfully get the entity from the left side to the right side. And if we use this configuration space as the range of an artificial potential function, we can then use gradient descent to determine the best way to move through the configuration space in order to achieve our goal. Hopefully that made sense to everyone. These are topics that are kind of discussed in several lectures at robotics courses. So I tried to kind of simplify it to the degree that we can talk about the work that I do with these. So in the previous work, I didn't really mention it because it wasn't relevant, but we were still using a configuration space. However, our configuration space was simply the X and Y coordinates in the physical environment. And because we are so used to thinking about Cartesian coordinates in an environment, it didn't make sense to draw upon the fact that we were using configuration space. However, in order to achieve the environmental alignment, we need to have a condensed state of both the virtual and the physical environment. And so we can create configurations that represent both the physical and virtual poses. So here's kind of a generalized version of the attractive component of the new potential function. We have a weight variable, and then we have a distance between the current configuration and the configuration that would represent environmental alignment. And again, we conducted a series of experiments for this work, but I'm just going to talk, for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about one of the ones that I kind of found most interesting. And so our question is, can we use this notion of reactive environmental alignment in order to reverse the effects of redirected walking? Again, we opted for simulation-based evaluation for the same reasons that I stated before. And as before, each condition consisted of 100 trials. For each trial, the simulated user would start at the virtual and physical origin. They, what we're calling an inflection waypoint, would be randomly placed on a circle with radius either 5, 10, 20, or 30 meters, centered at the virtual origin. The simulated user would walk towards that single inflection waypoint, stop, turn around, and walk back. And then the physical and virtual origins represented this alignment target configuration. So that's a kind of a long way of saying that the user started in a aligned fashion. That is, right away, the user would be able to interact with the physical environment. However, as they walk towards the inflection waypoint, we applied redirected walking, and that notion would be lost. And the goal was to have them walk back towards where they started and try to undo the effects of redirected walking, and hopefully so that they would end up in a position where they could interact with the physical environment again. We studied two independent variables for this experiment. The inflection waypoint distance, which again was mentioned to be 5, 10, 20, and 30 meters, and whether or not alignment was applied on the return path. And so the simulated user walked to this inflection waypoint. During that walk, again, redirected walking, avoidance redirected walking would be applied. That is trying to have the user avoid the boundaries of the physical environment. Then on the return path, either alignment would be applied. That is, we would turn off the avoidance redirection and turn on the alignment redirection, or we would just keep the avoidance redirection. We studied two dependent variables, the number of resets and the positional alignment era completion. And so this is simply how far away they were from that goal configuration that would represent the identity mapping. We had two hypotheses here again. We hypothesized that the alignment conditions would result in lower positional error, as that was kind of the whole goal of this alignment redirection algorithm. And the second hypothesis with longer inflection waypoints would also result in lower positional error, as they would have more time on the return path to realign with the physical environment. As before, results were non-parametric and were hence analyzed with using standard non-parametric tests. And again, we maintained the alpha value of 0.05. Here's the results for resets. On the left and right, we have the number of resets. The left is the no alignment condition, and the right is the alignment condition. The y-axis is the number of resets. I'm sorry, that I should say resets, not error. And then the bottom is the inflection waypoint distance. And the kind of extraneous cases, the 5-meter inflection waypoint and the 30-meter inflection waypoint, both provided significant results. For the alignment error, on the left, again, we have no alignment condition. On the right, we have the alignment condition. The y-axis here is alignment error in meters, and the x-axis is, again, the inflection waypoint distance. The inner conditions, the 10 and 20 meter conditions, proved to be significantly different. And there's a lot of things that we can draw from this. However, the thing I'd really like to point out is when we look at just the alignment condition for the positional alignment error. So the 30-meter condition performs significantly worse than both the 5 and 20-meter condition. And the 10-meter condition performs significantly better than all three of the others. So this leads us to believe that as you get farther away from this 10-meter inflection waypoint distance, alignment actually gets worse. And this kind of shows that there may be some ideal virtual distance at which to transition from avoidance redirection to alignment redirection. Oh, whoops, I just said all that. So that was, again, a really brief recap of some of the experiments that we've run for this work. There's a lot of really interesting future work that we think can come of this. So the artificial potential function approach to redirected walking was currently only applied using in a reactive manner where we had no knowledge of the user's intended path. And we're really interested in how we can potentially apply techniques like this to predictive algorithms. We're also very interested in multi-user alignment, perhaps allowing more than one user to be able to realign and be able to interact with each other. There has been, at the 2020 IEEE VR conference, there was one paper on a technique similar to this, but they weren't using a potential function approach, and it was kind of not as generalizable, I would say. Similar to the first point, we're interested in predictive environmental alignment. That is, again, when we have some sort of notion of the user's intended path, we expect that we should be able to better align to the physical environment. We're also very interested in uses for alignment other than physical interactions. There could be other mappings that would be interesting to explore, and using redirected walking techniques to achieve those mappings could lead to some very promising work. And finally, this notion of positional resets. So as we saw in those results, we were not able to achieve zero positional error. And as such, we need some way to compensate for that. And there's a few different techniques, but I'd like to really draw on inspiration from redirected walking itself. So redirected walking does not assume that we will be able to perfectly keep users away from the physical boundaries. And as such, we introduced rotational resets in order to, whenever the user's about to collide, we can reset them and continue their way. Similarly, we could perhaps use positional resets where when the user is supposed to be aligned to the physical environment and they're not quite there, we can stop the experience and reposition them so minorly in order to achieve that. So Adam mentioned that there's a slight delay between when I'm speaking and when questions will come in. So that concludes my talk. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. As you're typing those, I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Evan Sumer Rosenberg, for all of his guidance and help that he's given me. I'd like to thank Dr. Nora Ionian at the University of Southern California. She really kind of helped mold the original idea here. Dr. Stephen Guy and the rest of the Applied Motion Lab here at the University of Minnesota have really helped me kind of guide this idea into something that actually works. And finally, I'd like to thank my PhD committee. They have been graciously helpful in guiding my work. Yeah, so with that being said, I'm happy, again, to answer any questions you may have.
Okay. Thank you, Jerald. I'm going to switch from your slides to your video view. If you need me to switch back for you to show something, we can do that too.
Perfect.
But, you know, when we're asking and answering questions, you know, like to have a good look at you. Awesome talk. Very cool stuff. So, you have questions, but I got dibs, so I'm going to go first.
All right.
So right now you've done this with simulated users, right?
Yes.
Okay. Have you or are you going to attempt to look at this with actual empirical human subjects data? Now, the reason I ask is because, as we talked about last week, humans are weird. And so some of the things that we might assume that they would be more or less sensitive to might turn out not to be the case when we run them in reality. So thoughts?
Yes, that is very much something that we would like to do. I am working on the kind of final bits of my dissertation,
Uh-huh.
where we're trying to actually apply this notion of environmental alignment in a predictive manner. And we were thinking that would be an excellent opportunity to actually explore the interaction between physical interactivity and redirect walking. That's something that hasn't been able to be done before. And however, with the recent state of the world that has had to be put on hold, if I'm intending to be able to defend this fall. And so we're currently looking at alternative methods to evaluate the techniques that I'm developing. But yes, in the future, I think that this would be something that would be super interesting to explore in actual user experiences.
Cool. Yeah, and hey, dude, don't forget, you're gonna have a long career in front of you. You have time to investigate these things.
Right.
So, yeah. Uh, cool. And Haley has at least one question. Uh, cool. So, let's see. Adaptive redirected walking methods. This is Haley
Mm-hmm.
speaking. Uh, use non-uniform translations and rotations of users' gaze. Do you know how these adversely affect people's spatial orientation? Prior studies, like Interante's classic 7-league boots research, find that non-uniform translations do not, so long as the gain values are, in quotes, reasonable.
Okay. What was the main question there? Sorry.
The main question was, do you know how these adversely affect people's spatial orientation? Or can you speculate?
Okay. So there has been research that has actually been done on this. Notably by my advisor, Dr. Emerson Rosenberg. Um, and they shown that as long as you maintain these thresholds, spatial awareness does not seem to be affected, at least when compared to just natural locomotion.
Cool, cool. Let's see. There's additional. I think there's a follow up, but I wonder if redirected methods might make users disoriented in practice when the work moves beyond simulation. Also, this work, like many other redirected walking studies, requires a fairly large space to work well. Do you think we're far off from developing a redirected walking method for smaller spaces? And she
That's an
follows up
excellent
with, I
question.
know this is a hard problem, smiley face.
No, this is an excellent question. So we're getting more into traditional redirected walking, which I have kind of dubbed in this work as avoidance redirected walking. This later work was actually using redirected walking techniques to achieve something other than collision or avoiding collisions with obstacles and boundaries. But we're still using the same techniques, the same gains. And so uh, we'll start with the second question. So to answer the second question, research has shown that predictive algorithms will vastly outperform reactive algorithms when they're applicable. And that kind of leads us to the notion that we need to start figuring out how we can best use these predictive algorithms and rely on reactive algorithms as kind of a uh, last ditch effort. And so that is why the kind of next bit here that I want to look at is how can we apply this notion of environmental alignment to predictive algorithms? And I'm
Cool.
sorry, the first part of that question was what?
Okay, but I wonder if redirected walking methods might make users
Oh,
disoriented in
right, past
practice.
simulation. Uh, so we do not we do not expect that that will be the case as we are maintaining the same perceptual thresholds as have been empirically identified in previous literature. But again, we have not actually run this with actual human subjects, and so that very well may be the case, but we don't expect it to be the case.
Cool. So along those lines, and let me just say, Haley, Bobby is doing a great job working with you because those are outstanding questions. And for those of you watching, Haley is going to be talking next week. So really excited to hear that work. So let me see. I had a question about this. So one of the sort of interesting things that this does is applying multiple gains simultaneously, and so we've got pretty good research on the rotational and translational gains, that people and curvature gains that you can apply that people won't typically notice. But this is a cool. I'm not so much looking for an answer to this because I know there's not one yet. But it'd be interesting to see if those thresholds still hold when they're used in tandem with each other, because
so that has actually been investigated to a degree. So Timothy Gretchen, with help from myself and some other people at ICT, ran a study looking at combining translation gain and curvature gain, and we found that it does have an effect. But we did not identify it as an effect that's great enough to impact future studies. And so, again, we only looked at the combination of the two, and we had to do kind of fairly broad strokes because the experiment started to balloon really quickly.
Of course.
And so it's something that could be looked at in much greater depth.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I really find interesting is individual variation. So, and again, this is another thinking about the individual user, the human subject here. For instance, I've found out over the years that I am very sensitive to rotational gain.
Okay.
Like I tend to surprise people because they're like, you're twisting me, I can feel it. I wonder if, or maybe you've noticed, because you've probably given some demonstrations of these kind of things before. How big are individual variations in sensitivity to this?
So this is a very multifaceted question.
As
so
good questions are.
I'm going to try to give a multifaceted answer. The short answer is quite a bit. Even if you look at the original literature by Frank Steinke and the others, there is quite a bit of variation among the individual users. Our lab looked into this a couple years ago. Courtney Hutton, who's another PhD student in Evan's lab, actually looked at trying to determine a method to quickly ascertain an individual's rotation gain. And I believe that was published at ICAT in 2017 or 2018. And she found that there is quite a bit of a difference, and we can actually start to find different ways, and she found a way to kind of quickly ascertain that on an individual level.
Cool.
We have not looked into that for translation gain or curvature gain. That is something that'd be very interesting to look at in the future. However, there are several interactions with this as well. So one thing that we're looking at investigating is not only how much gain you can apply, but how quickly you can change the values that you're applying. And we also expect that to vary differently among users. Additionally, research has shown that users will accommodate or become used to redirected walking gains, and you can actually apply more gain to a degree as the experience goes on. And I would expect that to also be very variable based on the individual user.
Cool.
And so there's a lot of variability based on the individual user, and not nearly enough research looking into how to best use that variability or even understand it.
Well, see, you're describing a whole career path right there, you know. Uh, so you said something about how quickly you can change these values, which brings me to one of my PhD students. He's a cat guy, and he's asked interesting questions before about VR, which you typically wouldn't think of. What does it mean for my cat? And while you were talking about you know repulsors and everything to get people to or away from a certain part of the physical space, how quickly could you do this in real time? Thinking about avoiding William's cat. It's a half a joke question, but could you potentially use something like this to help people avoid obstacles that might be in your room that might not be stationary, like say your dog taking a nap enters the room?
Right. So that was something that we didn't explore in the original work, but identified as one of the assumptions of an ideal environment, right? That is static. And again, that's often not the case. The work that we presented was not really optimized for that. And I don't think you could quickly change course, or I don't think you could change a user's course quickly enough to avoid collision with something that's not trying to actively avoid collision with you, like a cat. That being said, that's with the assumptions that, one, we're not going to perform a reset, which we could obviously do. We could stop the experience and say, hey, something's about to happen, just chill, and then we'll let you keep going in a bit. Or two, exceeding the perceptual limits, which has been something that's been started to look at in the recent literature, where if something's about to happen and we don't have the gains in order to avoid it, we can temporarily go past those perceptual limits, and the user may notice it and may even be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's going to be for a very limited amount of time.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah, VR is all about trade-offs. Awesome. Well, Jerald, thank you very much. And you can't see the chat dialogue, but your advisor has joined us and says hello. Hey, Evan. So we're gonna go ahead and wrap the stream up there. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so this would normally be the part in the talk where we thank our speaker, yay! So I'll do that on your behalf. All right, everybody, thank you for joining us for our seminar today, and a great talk from Jerald, and some excellent questions from the audience. Looking at you, Haley, and also looking forward to seeing your talk next week. And for those of you watching, come see Haley's talk next week. Okay. So we're going to wrap up the stream there. Everybody, I hope you're staying happy, healthy, and safe, and we'll see you next week. Take care, all. Okay, Jerald, we